So today in the gospel we have a wedding story, and that's not really John's focus. He uses the story of the wedding to teach a very powerful lesson. But as we start the gospel, we see Mary and Jesus and the disciples celebrating this wedding, and then disaster happens. They run out of wine. Now, in Jewish culture, to run out of wine or to run out of anything at a wedding feast is not a very good omen, because if the bride and groom can't manage a simple wedding feast, what else might be amiss in their relationship? And Mary brings this to Jesus' attention because she's a mother and she's concerned for this couple. She doesn't want them to be dogged by this memory in the minds of other people. But that's, again, not the main point that John brings out. John, in the interaction between Jesus and Mary, makes Mary the archetype or the symbol of Israel. And Mary comes to Jesus and she's really saying, Jesus, these people are not they don't have joy. She's speaking for all of Israel, who have been subjected to conquest and deportation for centuries. And now they're again under the rule of Rome. And so God's people are lacking in joy. And Mary, speaking for her people, reminds Jesus that God's promise was that he would always provide joy for his people and hope. And this ties in with what we hear in the first reading. Isaiah, speaking on God's behalf, speaks to the people of Israel and gives them this promise that God will release them from their sorrow, from the things that oppress them, and that they will again have joy in God's presence. And so as Jesus provides that gift of wine for the wedding feast, he's really saying to Israel and through the gospel saying to us, God's love, which is so immense, will always be present for us, will always give us what we need in order that we can experience that joy and that peace that's God's hope and plan for us from the very beginning of creation. And then as disciples of Jesus, we're called to recognize through Mary's, call to Jesus, but also to her call to us, that we are called to now be instruments of healing, of joy, and of peace for God's people. And remembering that, everyone is part of God's people, because we're all created by God, we're all loved by God. And so God wants for all of us to experience that peace and that joy. St. Paul reminds us in his first letter to the Corinthians of this call to be instruments of God's healing and peace and love. And he reminds us that, the Spirit gives many different gifts to different people. And that all of the gifts that are given for the purpose of giving life to others. They're given to us as individuals for the service of others. And so Paul gives various examples, and he says, there are many gifts, they're all given by the same Spirit. There are many types of service, always to the same Lord. There are many calls, always for the same purpose. And they're given to us by the Spirit and directed by the Spirit for the common good. And so today, as we celebrate the gift of God's love for us in the Eucharist and in the Word, we're reminded that we in turn are called now to share those same gifts with the people that we encounter along the way. So what we're really called to today is to come to a deeper sense of our vocation as disciples to be instruments of God's healing and love in our world. And then we're called to take time to reflect on, what are the gifts that God has given me? What are the gifts that God has given to each one of us? And how are we called to use those gifts? How are we called to share those gifts with the people that we encounter along the way? And if we're anything like Mary, who is at the feast is attentive to what's going on. As we listen to the news, as we watch what's happening in our world around us, we can't help but respond, because it's God's desire that all people experience the wonder of God's love for them.